Good morning, atheists, agnostics, freethinkers, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. So today we're having a talk on a book called Payback, Revenge, Retaliation, and Redirected Aggression, written by David Barash and Judith Eve Lipton. On the one hand, we can say that the topic of peace, retaliation, revenge, and redirected aggression has nothing to do with atheism. But it does, because given that we don't believe in divine intervention to help solve any of our problems, and the fact that this book goes to the very heart of secular ethics and the question of how do we try to be good people? So the prescriptive here, but I am wanting to share this book, which I thought was a super great book. So I had a personal experience about 20 years ago that this book kind of reminded me of. So about 20 years ago, I knew these two students who were from Sri Lanka, that the student housing had put them together in one apartment. Someone in housing must have thought, they're from the same country, they'll enjoy living together. And the problem was that the Sinhalese, one was Sinhalese and the other was Tamil, and at that time, those two groups had been at war in Sri Lanka for about 10 years. The war would ultimately claim about 100,000 people. They spoke different languages, they had different religions, they wore different style of clothing, and most importantly, they hated each other. So I was always trying to understand what was the deal with these two groups. And in addition to sort of studying the conflict, what was written about the conflict, I would just ask these two guys. I'd go to one of them and say, what's the fighting about? And he would list all of these events. And then finally, of the final event, I'd say, well, and so what caused that? And then, he'd list some more events. And I would go to the other guy and I'd say, what's going on? And he'd say, well, we did this in retaliation for this other thing. And we did that because they had attacked us 6 months earlier. And it was clearly a case of what Gandhi called an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. As far as these young men were concerned, it came down to endless rounds of who had hit whom most recently. Now in the book, Payback, the authors give a similar case, this time of a Palestinian woman who became a suicide bomber. Her brother and her cousin had been killed by Israelis. We must consider that in political conflicts, the violence being perpetuated becomes personal, as people know someone or identify with someone who was killed, and then an endless cycle of retaliation begins. This obviously is in addition to other factors such as ideological conflicts, boundary disputes, struggles over resources. And in addition to the official reasons for war, sometimes people just want revenge. So how can we stop cycles of retaliation on a geopolitical scale? Well, we can't even stop the cycle of retaliation that happens in our kitchens, playgrounds, and offices. Especially because, as the authors point out, that to appear weak is often to actually invite more exposure to pain. So it isn't just as simple as, everyone needs to be a peacemaker. Why do we retaliate and seek revenge? How common is redirected aggression, and how can it have an evolutionary basis? Well, redirected aggression is when Sally hits Mark and Mark hits Jane. What's the connection between redirected aggression and religious scapegoating? Given that we have an interest, or I have an interest in promoting peace, and we have an upcoming talk on the book War is a Lie, how can we overcome our natural desire for revenge and stop from engaging in military conflicts and even military scapegoating? What about forgiveness? How can humans learn to forgive ourselves and each other in a way that leads us out of the cycles of revenge and redirected aggression? So the book was written by an evolutionary biologist and a psychologist, with a lot of evidence from animal research to back up the ideas. Not only do humans seek revenge, retaliate, and redirect aggression, but evidently so do mice, monkeys, apes, fish, chickens, lizards, birds, and many other animals. So there must be some evolutionary benefit that this gives us. So what exactly, am I talking about? Let me define some terms. So retaliation is when someone does or says something to you and you immediately respond in kind, about the same level of aggression. Someone says something unkind, a few minutes later you say something back hurtful, or even just respond with an edge in your voice. The level of payback is about the same as a perceived hurt. And this takes place usually within seconds. We see it with children, right? One child jostles another while passing through a narrow space. The other child yells, "Hey, dummy!" And it's much subtler with grown-ups. The point of these very quick cycles of aggression and immediate pushback is to say, watch yourself. We try to civilize humans out of this response. Take a deep breath, check in with your body, notice where your body feels the upset, let it go, learn to use your words. Now, revenge may take hours or weeks, but the victim eventually does something to hurt the aggressor or his kin. Oddly, this time, the payback is disproportionately large. In the animal kingdom and in stereotypical gangster culture, this type of payback is often directed at the kin of whoever is the target. Imagine Christopher Walken whispering, "I know where your boy goes to school. I'd hate to see anything happen to him." On the other hand, humans like stories of revenge. We understand the phrase, "he got what was coming to him." Think of Fredo on the boat. Now, Michael Corleone is a bad guy and no one would want to identify with him, so I'll stop right there. Machiavelli said our enemies should be caressed, but if you're going to punish them, then the punishment must be absolute so that they cannot seek revenge. Most religious traditions try to teach people to avoid revenge because revenge carries with it a risk. In other words, revenge is the thing that leads to the endless cycle of retaliation. Now, redirected aggression is unique in that it is both extremely common and almost never named. As my friend says, shit floats downstream. And that's what this is. When someone feels subordinate stress, literally the stress of being subordinate, they turn around and take it out on someone who is lateral or subordinate to them in the hierarchy. Something happens, intentional or not, even stressors such as traffic, natural disasters, reduced income, or the dog getting into the trash. The person builds up an unmanageable amount of stress and then takes it out, but this time on innocent bystanders. Sometimes this is immediate. The big ape pushes a smaller ape who pushes an even smaller ape. Or Joe is rude to Albert and then Albert walks out the door and is rude to his personal assistant Kevin. This type of aggression is very tied to hierarchy, and it is the stress one experiences as being a subordinate that basically just has to take whatever's being dished out to you. But instead of just taking it, one pays it out to someone who is lateral or lower on the hierarchy. Accumulated negative experiences build up and increase your stress level until you snap and aggress on bystanders. This is the only form of aggression not condoned by society, by any society. And yet it is extremely common. Okay? Now maybe the other, right, not condoned. No, they couldn't find any society that actually celebrates or condones redirected aggression. It is extremely common animal to animal and person to person, and even for that matter, person to animal and so on. We think of this as a case of road rage. Someone's frustrated, they had to stay late at work, they got stuck in traffic, someone cuts them off, they feel totally out of control, and then they snap and lose their common sense and start aggressing on total strangers, okay? Racing through the meridian, sideswiping cars. But more common is being stuck in traffic, someone cuts you off, feeling out of control, and then huffing at the cashier because the transaction is taking too long. Snapping at the telemarketer who interrupts your dinner, or frowning at the child who asks you to read to her at bedtime. So quoting them, they say, redirected aggression is the targeting of an innocent bystander in response to one's own pain and injury. It seems not only absurd, but also morally bankrupt, and is downright dangerous. It is explicitly condoned by perhaps no societies, but it is so widespread as to be essentially universal, and also not coincidentally overlooked. It is an extremely common form of aggression, but it is so common we do it often unconsciously. But we're familiar with this idea. When we hear stories about people who turn out to be hateful and cruel, we often understand when we hear that something terrible has happened to them, that we imagine made them that way. And then the authors take great pains to point out that not everyone who inflicts pain on others was themselves a victim. Some people are just sociopaths. That's interesting because maybe there are some people we can help and some people who currently we have no strategies for helping. Redirected aggression is a type of aggression that is also practiced on animals all over the world when they are killed in ritual slaughter as scapegoats. Now, I don't care how many prayers you say over an animal while you do it. If you're slitting the throat of an innocent animal that you believe you've transferred your sin onto, I would say you cannot offload your responsibility for wrongdoing onto an animal. And it is nothing more than redirected aggression. I actually personally find the topic a little bit upsetting, and I did spend a good amount of time trying to understand why this is done for religious reasons. I won't go into that here. But some people believe that animals are not conscious. In fact, the majority of people do, perhaps. They were created for eating, and since ritually slaughtered animals are then used for food, that also goes into part of the justification. So a topic where atheists are not likely to come to agreement, just another ethical dilemma that I'm sure we'll be talking about for the next 100 years, but to my mind, a clear case of redirected aggression, which is generally acknowledged as immoral, unless you're doing it to animals. And a much nicer version of this, of course, is where the sin is transferred onto a goat, and then the goat is set free into the wilderness, and that's where we get the term scapegoating from. When I read this to Stephen, of course, he brought up another, ultimate case of rituals or another case of sacrifice that a lot of people feel happen that takes away their sins. There is a huge psychosocial need to be met here. So let's talk about that, the need for forgiveness. We want to send the sin away and to know that we are forgiven. There's a chapter that involves various paths towards peace. I'm going to select one of them, and that's the 12-step path. And know that this is not like an endorsement necessarily of the 12 steps. It's just one example that I thought was kind of interesting. So it's said by Anne Lamott, not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the other guy to die. The problem with forgiveness is that it puts so much weight on us as the forgivers, on our shoulders. We're told to forgive, not for the other person, but for ourselves. We're poisoning ourselves with resentment. So, and in fact, one of the people I admire most in the world, who is a devout Catholic, basically said that to me. We forgive not for the other person, but for our own peace of mind. And so I started wondering, are there limits to forgiveness? Particularly since, in reality, it's human being to human being where the forgiveness happens. Can I give you absolution? Absolution being defined as a release from guilt or obligation. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. But there are some people who believe that making amends is required if our context is a need for forgiveness. Okay, making amends helps heal wounds. You can say that you're sorry and you can ask for forgiveness, but before you ask for forgiveness, you need to acknowledge, here is what I'm willing to do. Here's the wrong I've done, and here's what I'm willing to do to try to make it right. And then ask for forgiveness. And if the person says there's nothing you can do to ever put it right, I will never forgive you, you can still try to make amends and try to put things right in the world. It can't change the past, but it could change your future. If you were a drunk or a person with alcoholism, however you want to say it, I know plenty of alcoholics who like to not sugarcoat that and say I was a drunk and neglected my child. Well, now that actual child might allow you to be in their life and help babysit your grandkids. And if they won't, maybe you can volunteer and help some other kids. Then ask for forgiveness, and even if the person never forgives you, you don't get your apology, but you might still find peace because you know you tried to make amends. And here's the thing about amends. Even if you were the victim and not the victimizer, you can still make amends, because amends means trying to repair something. So even if it happened to you, you can try to repair it by doing something that puts some good out into the world. The idea is to create peace in the world by creating peace within yourself. To create peace within yourself by contributing peace to the world. The authors of this book also say that essentially here's the deal. You've got to do something about your stress. And if you don't, you end up taking it out possibly on someone else or turning it inward on yourself, possibly even getting depressed or having other problems. So look for ways to deal with your stress that are healthy. Social support, exercise, sports, meditation, mindfulness, creative outlooks, fun, and even nutrition can support you in your healthy attempts to deal with stress. Because remember what Marcus Aurelius said, the best revenge is to be unlike him who caused the injury. At Seattle Atheist Church, I always close the same way. Atheists believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. Thank you.